Hello and welcome to the First Friday training series. This is our recording for capital budgeting for universities. On the agenda today, we're going to be doing an introduction to capital, followed by the capital budgeting process. So we'll go over budget codes, budget funds, budget revisions, and budget allotments. We'll follow that up with transfers, which are pretty common in capital, and then project and year / quarter and closeout in regards specifically to what we're looking for when closing out capital for the quarter of the year. So capital is defined in statute. It's a project that's over $100,000 and it falls into one of these categories. It's a real property acquisition, a new construction, or a repair and renovation, which I often refer to as R&R. So if you hear me say R&R, it's repair and renovation project. We call capital projects 4 types often because they start with a 4, both the budget code and the budget fund for a project will start with the number 4. And then importantly, capital projects are non-reverting, which means when we reach the end of a fiscal year, the funds, the budget authority will remain where it is as we go into the next fiscal year. Those won't go anywhere, and they stay there for the life of the project until we're ready to close those out. Common fund sources for capital projects. Most common right now is the State Capital and Infrastructure Fund. That's a cash-based fund awarded on cash flow kind of basis. You'll see this often used for name projects in budget bills. So on the right-hand side of the screen, that's an example of a section of a budget bill naming projects to be funded from the State Capital and Infrastructure Fund. I'll call that SCIF from here on out. That's usually how we abbreviate it. Repair and renovation funds are also usually funded through that SCIF, as well as flex funds, which are a support fund for named projects from budget bills. Another common fund source would be university receipts, anything from, housing receipts, dining receipts, athletic receipts. If there is an authorized project or there's an authorized use for those university receipts, they can fund a capital project. Bond and debt, we still have a few statewide debt projects out there, but it's less common now. There really aren't many new ones, although there are some self-liquidating debt at the university levels that can fund projects in certain scenarios. And then finally, grants, which often gets lumped into receipts, but we've split it out here to highlight that grants, you now have to have specific authority to use it for a capital project. It used to be that there was some boilerplate language around using those, but you do need specific authority to use those on a capital project moving forward. So the first thing you need to look at when trying to set up a capital project is the authority. So what is it that allows me to set this capital project up? On the screen are a few examples. The kind of middle upper picture here is showing a section of a budget bill, a session law passed by the General Assembly that lists out projects that are authorized to exist and start. On the right-hand side of the screen is a snapshot of a memo from OSBM. In this case, it was granting specific projects authority to go forward from a funding stream that was authorized also in a budget bill. So that's a common type of universities. Often you'll see a board of governors meeting minute item or a board of trustees memo or even a chancellor or president memo sign off on a project, giving that project authority. And then at the bottom of the screen is a screenshot of a statute as an example of sometimes statutes authorize specific capital projects. In that case, this was authorizing to specific agencies the authority to do projects in a specific set of circumstances. So common capital project authorities that you'll see, as mentioned before, if the General Assembly passes a session law, can be the Budget Bill or Appropriations Act. It can also just be another session law that lists a project, authorizing that project to go forward. That would be the authority for that project. Repair and renovation projects, those actually the repair and renovation funds are passed in a budget act, but then those are awarded by the Board of Governors to specific projects. So really both of those are combined for the authority for a specific project. Emergency projects, these are a little bit more rare, but if DOA declares an emergency and there is a threat to public health or life and safety, you can cite those on an emergency project request. Again, a little bit more rare, and you'll have to work with your analyst on those. Chancellor's R&R projects, there is a specific statute authorizing the chancellor to authorize a repair and renovation project, I believe under 600,000. That statute is 143C 8-13D. So that would be what you would cite for those chancellor R&R projects. And then other delegated authorities. So these are those memos I was talking about. So it's really coming from the Board of Governors authority, but that authority has been delegated down to another level, like Board of Trustees, Chancellor, President, that kind of thing. And in those cases, you're really going to want to cite the memo that that level has signed off on that project. So Board of Trustees has delegated authority and approves a specific project, you'll want to cite that memo that they approved. Some common capital budget increase authorities you'll see. So after a project's set up, if it needs additional funding, these are some common authorities you'll use to increase that budget. So General Assembly, same situation where maybe they increase a project in a session law, you would cite that session law. Board of Governors, repair and renovation reallocation. So there is authority to reallocate R&R. And Board of Governors might do that in their meeting minutes. You might also have some other delegated authority there where you would cite perhaps a memo or a letter from maybe the system office authorizing the reallocation of a repair and renovation. Flexibility funds these are used specifically for named projects in a budget bill, but universities can apply for those through OSBM. And so you would cite both the original session law for setting up those flexibility funds, as well as the OSBM memo awarding your specific project the increase. And then other delegated authorities, again, if you have a project being increased through some sort of delegated authority to Board of Trustees or to your president or chancellor, whatever, you would cite that memo that awards that project an increase. Self-liquidating bonds are allowed in certain circumstances from universities. I think the main point of this slide is that you'll need to go through some extra steps, really checking with your analyst and with OSBM. OSBM has to approve that self-liquidating bond. So essentially, you're going to send us your materials before setting up a project, in addition to the other authority authorizing it. We'll need to see those materials. OSBM can allow more limited setup with cash that would then be refunded through a later bond. But again, just working with your analyst, those require some extra steps. This is the 725 report. So this is the main report that OSBM analysts are using to track a project. And really this is the report in NCFS that is the official project budget, if you will, for the state of North Carolina. There's multiple versions. The version I usually prefer is the 725 regular report. I think there's a detailed one as well. The official name for the report is at the top of the screen. If you get NCFS access and search for that specific name, you can favorite it. That's the one we usually use. And here's a little snapshot at the bottom of your screen of what we see on our end and what you should see on your end as well. You'll see within a budget code, a specific budget fund for a project, that project's budget, allotments, actuals, and then allotment balance. And there's some different levels of actuals there, current, year-to-date, and life-to-date. And then you'll see specific account lines for each. And those become important, especially with things like the SCIF, where we are tracking specific SCIF years. Those have a specific account that goes with them. So if you ever run into any issues there, use the 725 report, and that's what we're looking at. So the capital budget process, this is a quick overview. So a budget code is going to be created by OSBM. Then authority for a project will be identified by you, and you will then submit a budget fund request based on that authority in IBIS, making sure it's also established in Interscope. I believe System Office usually sets those up in Interscope. So just making sure it's set up in Interscope before submitting an IBIS or at the same time as submitting an IBIS. Then the budget for that project would be set up via revision in IBIS. I believe they're usually set up with the initial setup in Interscope, but just making sure that that budget's where it needs to be in Interscope as well. And then allotments as needed. So allotments are your authority to spend money. So you'll request those as you intend to spend funds for the project. So budget codes, one of the common questions we'll get at the start of the fiscal year is how do I set up my budget code? When do I set up my budget code? And the answer is you do not set up your budget code. OSBM will set up a budget code for you to use. So we set up a new one every fiscal year for every university. It starts with the number 4, as mentioned before. That's why we call them 4 types. The next 2 digits will denote the fiscal year, and the final 2 digits will denote the university. So for example, UNC Asheville for fiscal year 2025, the budget code will be 42427, and the next year it'll be 42527. So your agency, your university 2 digits should always stay the same, and you'll see those middle 2 digits increasing every fiscal year. A quick note on this, just because I think it can get confusing sometimes. The fiscal year digits are associated with the first year in a fiscal year. So for FY 2024-25, it's actually 24 that will be used. The budget funds. So OSBM has set up your budget code, but the university will actually set up their budget funds, request those through IBIS, and you will pick your budget fund number. There is a list of budget funds available to each university that I believe OSC has, but essentially these are going to be consecutive with the first 3 digits should be the same for the agency or university. The next 3 digits, you're just going in order. So after you set up 402-485, the next project you set up should generally be 402-486 and so forth. You are allowed to leave a gap. So if you're going to a new budget code, but you know you have a few projects to set up for the previous year still, you could leave a gap of a few numbers that you know you could go back and set up projects for those and fill in the gap. But otherwise, you should generally be consecutive with this numbering system. So what is a budget fund? In general, a budget fund is referring to a group of related programs or activities. In the operating world, this will be used year after year to track that similar activity. In the capital world, we're looking at a budget fund is capturing a specific project. And when that project is complete, it will no longer be used. So unlike operating, think of a budget fund to that one specific project. When the project's done, that budget fund is also gone and no longer used again. The asterisk here is for the specific project. The note on this one is that you can, in some occasions, combine multiple projects into one budget fund. You would want to work with your analyst on it, but an example of where you might do this, we had a DPS warehouse example here. The budget bill actually granted 2 separate projects, one for the warehouse expansion, one for the lot acquisition for the same warehouse expansion. The agency contacted their OSBM analysts and kind of said, you know, can we combine this under one budget fund? We looked into it and the answer was yes. So in some occasions, you might be able to put multiple projects under the same budget fund. Make sure as you go along that Interscope is set up before as you're requesting things in IBIS. And what we're looking at to double check this is the authorization screen. So here you see an example. That authorization screen is showing this is non-general fund project for $2 million. And you can kind of see the headers in the upper right give a little additional information. Another note on this next screen is you can use the program as you're setting up projects. A lot of times the program tab that you have to kind of work your way to find, the program tab will have additional information sometimes, especially if it's not a Board of Governors approved item. So in this case, it was a Board of Trustees item, and the program tab actually has an attachment to that specific Board of Trustees item. Going into there is going to be the best way to set up and get the information you need for a budget fund request in IBIS. So in this case, that Board of Trustees item lays out, this is dining receipts. So you can use that for your revenue source. The amounts there, the name of the project's there, and the date of approval. And this would actually be the authority you're citing as that Board of Trustees approval in August of 2025. So looking at the actual budget fund request in IBIS, you'll have your budget code at the top, the budget centers code that's referring to the budget fund number that you're selecting. That's the old terminology, so just know that that is the budget fund. The effective date, I think some folks like to put the date that it was authorized by whoever is authorizing it, Board of Governors, Board of Trustees. But you can also just select the date that you're submitting. I don't think it has too much effect, so using the submittal date is perfectly okay and safe. Company code will always be the same for your university. Similarly, GASB should always be the same for university capital projects. For both of those, you can go to previous budget fund requests you've made and just copy and paste it over. Although for the GASB one, it is specific to capital. So if you're copying and pasting over, make sure you're looking at a previous capital budget fund request as you do that. Short title and long title are there. And then we get down to the lower sections. So the lower sections start with fund purpose, where you're going to describe what the project is, justifications, where you're going to put what authority you have to do the project, revenue source, it's where you're putting what revenue is being used for the project, in this case, state capital and infrastructure fund. And finally, expenditure accounting activity. Generally, you can just put capital expenditures here, and that is good enough. They're just trying to make sure they know what kind of spending is happening in this budget fund. A few tips from things we've seen over the years. For the long title, make sure that it's clear to us what that project is, and we should be able to match it up to both the Interscope approval and whatever item was authorized. So if it's in a budget bill, if it's in a Board of Governors minutes, the name should track pretty closely, if not the same thing. And I think a good rule of thumb is just making sure that the name is the same as it is in the Interscope item, or as close as possible. Another note here is that the short title is 25 characters or less in IBIS. And so if you're copying and pasting into that short title field, just know that it will cut off the paste at 25 characters. So go back, double check to make sure that that short title is understandable at that character limit. For the fund purpose and justification, I know some folks like to use the same thing for both fields, which is okay as long as all the information's there we're looking for. But best practice is actually to use the fund purpose field to describe the project that's happening. If it's a roof repair on a project, if you have more information about why the project's needed. The justification would then be used for the specific authority, so your session law, your general statute, what Board of Governors meeting something was approved in, or other authority. That is the best practice there. And a note for the Board of Governor, Board of Trustee, or other delegated authority approvals, please try to use the date of the item that was approved. So if you have a Board of Trustees memo that authorized the project, go ahead and include what the Board of Trustees, approval, and then the memo date. If you don't have the exact date, or if the date tends to fluctuate sometimes um, between a few days, you can go ahead and put the month and the year, and that should be good enough. And for chancellor's delegated authority, that is actually in statute. So please cite that statute 143C-8-13D if it's a chancellor's delegated or a chancellor's R&R project, as mentioned before. For a revenue source, you're generally just going to put where the revenues are coming from, what receipts are being used. A note on this one, if you're using state capital and infrastructure fund, just say that, or just say skip. You don't need to put the exact year, as that might change later down the road. We want to kind of capture all SCIF. It's not as important in this case what year it came from. If you're using university receipts, you can just say university receipts. If you know the specific one, you can list that out too. If there's multiple that could be used, go ahead and list them all. We just want to make sure you're covering your bases there. Batch budget fund request. So we do have a batch budget fund request form. It's essentially an Excel spreadsheet. If it's not on our website, you can ask your OSBM analyst for it, and we can send it to you. This is a way to request 8 or more budget funds at one time. It's really not, I wouldn't say it's any faster to process, as this isn't being entered directly into IBIS. We'll actually have to manually have a tech team person put it into IBIS. But it is a good way to save you time from not having to open a bunch of individual budget fund requests, especially if they're all going to say the same thing. So for example, if UNC Asheville has a bunch of projects that were all approved in the same Board of Governors meeting, or have all the same authority, it might be easier to use this form. You can ask for it, we'll send it to you, and then kind of copy and paste to make sure you're using different budget funds. But that way you don't have to open 8+ forms in IBIS and copy and paste the same thing over and over again. It can just be easier to submit this way. The process for this is that you will fill out this Excel spreadsheet, send it to us, we'll review it, then we'll send it to OSC. After we and OSC have approved it, again, we'll send it to our tech team, our IBIS tech team, and they'll have to manually load that in. So again, it might not be a faster process, but it can be a little bit easier not having to submit so many individual budget fund request forms in IBIS.
All right, so now we're going to talk about revisions. So once a project has been approved, the budget fund is set up through IBIS. What should happen next after that? So generally, revisions are used to establish a new project, and they can also be used to increase, decrease, or close an existing project. You may have seen a version of this table before in other OSBM trainings, but we wanted to go over it a little more specifically to do with capital. So we have 11, 12, and 14 type revisions. For 11 types, these would be for changes that are directed by the General Assembly, or in this case, we'll go over this a little bit more, but for universities, that also goes through the Board of Governors. And this would also include OSBM's R&R allocations. These would impact both the certified and authorized budget, and would require an external IBIS revision that needs OSBM approval. And these can be used to change both requirements and receipts, and to transfer money across budget funds if a transfer is happening. 12 type revisions, these are for changes that are not directed by the General Assembly or Board of Governors, but the university does have authority in statute to make the change, whether to increase or decrease the funds. These would only impact the authorized budget, but would still require an external IBIS revision that would have OSBM approval, and again can be used to change the requirements and receipts and to transfer money across budget funds. Type 14s are generally allowed just through OSBM's policy and are used in pretty limited cases for capital. They would only affect the authorized budget. They would be submitted as an internal revision that doesn't require OSBM's review and approval. And that's because they're primarily used to realign expenditures in the requirements section of a budget fund. it's very rare that we would allow a type 14 revision to change anything in the receipts. If you're not sure which one to use, just reach out to your OSBM analyst. And so again, type 14s can only be used to make changes within a budget fund, but they can't be used to transfer money in or out of a budget fund or a project. We wanted to also point out a little more specifically what 11 and 12 types should be used for universities. It's a little more straightforward with agencies, but we do get some questions about this on the university side. So type 11, usually that's when the authority is coming from a session law. So this might be a named project for the university. And it would also be the initial allocation of repair and renovations funds that are coming from Board of Governors. So let's say for the 24 to 25 fiscal year, Board of Governors has their pot of R&R money that they allocate to different university projects. If it's the first time that money is being distributed, then this would be an 11 type to set up that budget or to increase it if it's a budget increase. And then type 12s would be used if there's any reallocation of that money. So whether that's, R&R is SCIF money, but if it's a SCIF reallocation of repair and renovations funds, this would be a type 12 because Board of Governors isn't exactly distributing it for the first time. It's just being moved between projects. So that would just be something that the university has authority to do by statute. These would also be used for any non-SCIF funded allocations that come through the Board of Governors. So even though just to say, just because it comes through Board of Governors meeting doesn't automatically mean that it's a type 11. If it's university receipts or, something else besides SCIF, it's still going to be a type 12 revision to set up that project. Additionally, Board of Trustees authorizations, Chancellor's repair and renovations projects, or any other delegated authority is going to be a type 12 revision. So just a few notes about revisions when you're setting up the project. So this would be the first revision that's processed once a budget fund is approved. It's really helpful for us if in the title you can specify the action that's taking place with the revision. So most of the time that would just be establishing the budget, including the project's name and budget fund number. Just make it much easier for reference as we're looking through these, or at some points if we need to go back and try to find a specific revision. The justification has to cite the specific legislative authority. So this can be the session law, or if it's authority just from general statute. Again, like with the budget funds, we would want to see if it's a Board of Governors meeting that this came through, including the date along with that, as well as for Board of Trustees or any other delegated authority. Again, if it's Chancellor's delegated authority or R&R, that should cite that specific general statute. A lot of times you can just copy and paste, honestly, the justification that was used for the budget funds. They're pretty much the same. And then lastly, if you're setting up a new SCIF project that has multiple years of intended allocations from multiple fiscal years, you can go ahead and set all of that budget up, and we'll look at an example of what that looks like. So if you're not sure where this is, we wanted to include a reminder about that. So on the left-hand side, the first picture is from the 6-year intended project allocation schedule from the Current Operations Appropriations Act or the budget bill. So anytime a budget bill is passed for a biennium, it will usually include this schedule for any SCIF funded projects and how much money the project will receive across those across those fiscal years. So you can see in this first one, this is an example from Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, where they had SCIF funding allocated to this project across 4 fiscal years. This can also be found for the years of the biennium that the budget bill is addressing in the House version of the budget. So you can see that in the second screenshot. It's just more of a description of this project, but it also includes the amount that it's receiving in those first 2 years that are included in the biennium. And then finally, in the last picture, you can see where DNCR went ahead and set up all 4 years of the intended allocation in NCFS. So whenever they processed the revision to set up the budget for this project, they included all 4 of those SCIF years. So this is what we would be looking for you to do if you have a project with multiple years of SCIF funding. We also wanted to go through just a few examples for revision types. So when you're setting up a project on the left, this is just an example of what that would look like if this was a project that was set up in a budget bill. This would be an 11 type because that's coming from the General Assembly. The effective date, again, can just be the date that you're submitting it. Because this is coming through a budget bill, you would want to check yes for the special provision. And then in the session law reference, you'd want to include that session law, but also the section number is really helpful. Budget bills are very long, but it's also just really helpful for us to be able to quickly find that reference and authority. So just make sure to include that as well. You would check that this is establishing a new project. In this specific example, if it was SCIF, you would check that it's general fund, that it's an expansion for a budget adjustment type, and then that it's a new project and including the full intended allocation for this example of $10 million. And then on the right, you can see an example of what's included in justification. So establishing the budget for a specific project, citing the same session law and section that's included in the main part of the revision, as well as the section that it's in for in the House budget. So like with budget funds, if there's any change happening to the project that would be an increase or decrease of budget, we would need to see that approved in Interscope first. So this is an example where, the Board of Trustees for UNC Charlotte increased funds for a project, and so they listed that specific authority and the date that it was approved. So this is what we would be looking for to approve in Interscope first before anything is then submitted in IBIS. But once that is set up, if the project is increasing or decreasing funds, then you can submit that revision in IBIS, again, just including the action, project title, and budget fund number in the title of the revision. In the justification, again, citing the relevant authority and the approval date, if this is from Board of Governors meeting or another memo that has that signature date. If you can, please include a detailed explanation of the need for the revision. So why is more funding needed for this project? If there are any significant impacts of the changes on the project scope and timeline, and then an updated total budget and resource allocation once this revision is processed. So an 11 type increase example, so let's say there's increase that comes through a Board of Governors meeting. It's the first time that that's being allocated from the Board of Governors. So this would be an 11 type revision. There's no need to check special provision because this isn't through a session law, but it would still be increasing that project. So you would just check that box. So as an example of what would be in the justification, you would include that it's Board of Governors meeting and the date of that meeting, the additional amount that's being added and why, and what the total new budget is from SCIF repair and renovation funds. For 12 types, an example of this could be, coming through the Chancellor's delegated authority. So if that's the case, you would want to check that it's 12 type, and again, that it's increasing the project, specifying what the additional funding that's being allocated is and why, and the total new budget and where that's coming from. So in this case, it would be housing receipts. And again, just making sure to include the date of whenever that letter was signed. This is a screenshot from the same budget fund that we've been looking at so far from the Department of Administration. With this, we really just wanted to point out that anytime a revision is processed in IBIS, it's going to affect just that total budget column and what's included in the expenditures and revenues. All right, so after any type of revision is processed, but you need to request the authority to actually expend the funds, you're going to submit an allotment request. So once a revision is processed, it doesn't mean that the agency or university can go ahead and start spending the money. We still need to request that authority to spend it over time. So of course that just can't exceed the total project budget. We do get questions about this sometimes because there are several different types of allotments that can be requested in IBIS. So we wanted to walk through each of those. For external allotments, those do require OSBM approval and are typically used for any non-SCIF or receipt-supported projects. SCIF allotments we'll dig into more, but just as an overview, these also require OSBM approval. For projects that are greater than $3 million, we ask that these are submitted quarterly and are generally used for named projects or for R&R. Bond requisitions, like we said, aren't used as much anymore, but for those that are active, they do require approval through OSBM. Requests for these from universities are submitted bi-weekly, so we usually send out an email asking for you to submit those IBIS requests, and they can only be used for current invoices. So the university has to have invoices on hand to request that exact amount. It can't just be an estimate of what you think is needed over time. And then finally, internal allotments can be processed without OSBM approval. But again, like internal revisions, these can really only be used to realign expenditures that have already been externally allotted. And just as a note that whenever those are processed, it will also act as an internal revision and realign the budget. So if you process an internal allotment, there's no need to also submit an internal revision like you would with an external allotment. Just a few tips for allotments. The effective date can just be the date that you're submitting it. It should only be for expected expenditures. In the justification section at the end of the month, it's helpful if you can just indicate the month when that approval is needed so we don't mess up anything with closeout for the month. And then finally, just making sure that correct allotment type is used depending on what you're requesting. SCIF allotments we'll talk about more in depth. This graphic is really just to show that when SCIF allotments are processed, it automatically triggers a journal entry that moves the cash from OSBM to the university, who then assigns it to the correct fund and receipt line item. So like it says at the bottom, just so using these will automatically move cash. And in part, we point this out because there are rare circumstances where an external allotment might be needed to fix something in SCIF receipts in the 725 report. So you can see in this example where in the red box, the funding source is incorrect. And then the total budget and allotments are sitting not where the correct funding source here is. The cash is already there in that 2023 funding source year. And so in this case, if we wanted to put the budget and allotments on the same line as the life to date cash, we would need to use an external allotment so that it doesn't mess anything up by moving any cash through a SCIF allotment. So it's pretty rare, but just reach out to us if you're not sure how to fix anything that may have looked like this based on conversions, because we know that's messed some things up in the 725 report. There are some nuances when SCIF allotments should be requested based on the size of the project. If the budget for the project is less than $1 million, you can request up to 100% of the total SCIF funds as long as those funds were appropriated in the past or current fiscal year. For projects that are between $1 and $3 million, we ask that you try to allot these via construction phase, so planning, construction, and closeout just generally. If you're not sure, these can be guided by the construction contract. And then finally, like we said before, if the project is more than $3 million, we ask that those are submitted on a quarterly basis based on projected cash expenditures. However, if additional funds are needed during the quarter, we can still approve supplemental allotments. Just because it's what you submitted in your quarterly allotment doesn't mean that's all that you're allowed to request. We're happy to work with you on that if that situation comes up. So just let us know. As you probably know, OSBM has universities submit a quarterly cash flow spreadsheet anytime they're requesting a SCIF allotment for one of these larger projects. Ultimately, these are used to help us track overall SCIF availability, the project's progress and timeline. So is it ahead or behind schedule at all? And then just monitoring for any over expenditures. One thing we wanted to point out, so this is the form that's actually used on the left-hand side when a quarterly allotment is submitted. A lot of times in the cash balance field, we get that the submission will just be the total project budget minus the total allotted to date, when really that should come from the allotment balance that's in the 725 report. So how much cash of what you've been allotted is still available to spend on the project as you're submitting a request for more funding. In order to draft this document, it can be helpful when you're trying to figure out project timing to consult with your facilities staff. And then for cash needs for the project over time, just working with the architect or construction manager as they can help you figure that out to put estimates into that document. Finally, just a few tips for SCIF allotments. Like we've said before, only current and past fiscal year funds can be requested. So we can't at this time do anything that's past fiscal year 2026. We also wanted to show you what the SCIF allotment approval looks like on our end. Sometimes we do get requests that have more than one SCIF year being requested in IBIS. When we're approving it, we see what's in the box and we can only select one. So if you have, let's say, a project that has 2023 and 2024 SCIF that you're needing to be allotted, those do have to be submitted separately because we can only choose one per request. Just a general note to make sure you're including the correct account number and funding source year. Sometimes those get mixed up. So just making sure that in looking at the 725 that you're requesting the right SCIF year and including that in the IBIS request. All right, and lastly for allotments, we have bond requisitions and internal allotments. Like we said before, bond requisitions should only be based on invoices, and when it's submitted, the allotment balance in the 725 should be $0. So any money that's already been drawn down should be spent before you can request any more. If you're drawing on a bond that hasn't been in a while, just specify in the justification why there was a time lapse in those requests. And we've been including this in our emails, but just a note that these are subject to potential legislation to have these completely closed out. So if you have a project that you think will be needing funds from a bond in the near future, please reach out to us so that we can work with you to get those drawn down if needed. Finally, for internal allotments, again, these can only be used for funds that have already been externally allotted and approved by OSBM. A lot of times this is used when universities or agencies are realigning expenditures for closeout. So you can see in this example from Department of Adult Correction, they had originally allotted funds just from their reserve because they knew how much they were going to be spending, but they didn't know exactly which accounts that would be spent from. So once that cash was spent, they used an internal allotment to realign it to the correct account to reflect where that spending actually took place. Like we said, this will also realign the budget. So once something like this is submitted, there's no need to submit an internal revision. But if you're not sure at any point, feel free to submit it as an external allotment, and OSBM is happy to go ahead and review that. So again, looking at what this looks like in the 725. So once an allotment request is approved, it is going to affect that total allotments column, or that's where that's going to show up. From left to right, you can see that your unallotted should reflect your total budget minus your allotments. Allotments would be anything that's approved in IBIS to spend. The life to date column is going to include your total project spending, so how much cash has actually gone out the door for that project. And then your allotment balance would be the allotments column minus the life to date spending. So again, what's left to spend of what funds you've already been allotted before you need to, so have an idea of how much is left before you need to request more funds. And then a couple of notes about Interscope. We've been talking about this through the presentation, but again, just making sure that at any point the budget is changing, that Interscope is reflected, or sorry, that it's reflected in Interscope to match IBIS and NCFS. And part of the reason that we ask universities to stay up to date on this is that when we're looking at contract approval, we're not just looking at Interscope. We're also looking at the funding availability in NCFS. So how much is in your allotment balance, as well as what's in the unallotted funds, because this totals your available cash left to spend on the project. And we're making sure that that doesn't exceed what's being requested in the specific contract.
So moving on to transfers, a first note, speaking of Interscope, if you're planning to transfer between projects, please make sure that that transfer is submitted in Interscope first. You can submit at the same time. It doesn't necessarily have to be approved in Interscope before you submit the IBIS part, but please just make sure that it is at least submitted in Interscope as well. So the most common type of transfer we see now is a SCIF transfer, and typically it's with repair and renovation SCIF. You are allowed to transfer repair and renovation funds left over on a project to a different repair and renovation project under General Statute 143C-8-13B. And a lot of times you'll get a Board of Governors authority for it as well. If the funds have not been fully allotted yet, how we'll want you to do that is just do a revision to reduce that SCIF budget authority in the sending budget fund 1, and then do another revision to increase the budget authority of that same SCIF in the receiving budget fund. However, if the SCIF it has already been allotted, you'll need to add some extra steps. So the first step would be a SCIF allotment form that unallots those funds in the sending budget fund. Then you'll do that same revision where you decrease the authority in that sending budget fund. Then you'll do a second revision to increase the authority in the receiving budget fund. And finally, you will do a SCIF allotment to allot those funds in the receiving budget fund. The reason we need to do this for SCIF is, one, to make sure we're keeping track of the SCIF. It'll keep that SCIF account associated with it with the same SCIF year as well, as opposed to having the SCIF be muddied up by, expenditure out, receipt in transfer accounts. Additionally, it keeps the project budget from being inflated. So if a project's completed, we'll actually have you reduce the authority to what the project actually spent, as opposed to doing an expense out transfer that might make the project look like it spent more than it did. Some other types of transfers. So again, repair and renovation funds, no matter when they were originated, are allowed to be transferred to other repair and renovation projects. Repair and renovation funds pre-SCIF usually come in the form of appropriations. We don't have a great way of transferring these, so the best way currently is to use that transfer out expenditure account that some of you might be used to, and a transfer in receipt account. Unfortunately, that's just the way we have to do that one. For operating transfers, so we're looking at, transferring carry forward from your operating budget to your capital budget, or transferring other operating funds that are already budgeted in your operating budgets to the capital. You'll actually want to do an operating revision and a capital revision. So the operating revision will transfer out to that capital budget fund, and then the capital revision will budget in that transfer in. And please cite, or kind of make a note of what the corresponding revision is, because we'll look at both to make sure both sides of the transfer are properly recorded. So as an example of a follow along, this is that same project we've been following along with, and it actually did have a transfer in. And this is partly to show you how we're tracking. This is the reason we need to do the SCIF with an unallotment, reallotment, and reducing and increasing authority is so we can keep that identification of the SCIF funds. So in this case, it was FY22 SCIF funds. This is an agency, so they're using the interfund. You don't have to worry about that. But this is just to show you that those SCIF funds will show up separately in their own new FY22 line in a budget that was previously just showing FY23 SCIF. So this is kind of what we expect to see after the transfer is completed. A common reason to transfer is when you're closing out a project. Again, making sure that if you're closing out a project, those steps are completed in Interscope at the same time as you're submitting them in IBIS. In this case, it was reducing authority, so making sure that you're requesting that transfer your request to the increase decrease request in Interscope at the same time or before you're submitting in IBIS. So for SCIF name projects that are closing, those SCIF funds more than likely actually have to be reverted to the SCIF. For R&R projects, as we mentioned before, we want you to transfer those remaining R&R funds to another project. So identifying another R&R project you can transfer those funds to. For non-SCIF projects, it's really going to depend on where the funds came from. A lot of times that dictates what you can do with the remaining funds, and it's going to be a little project specific there. For pre-SCIF, you're going to check with your analyst. Again, named projects might depend on what budget bill named them and what that budget bill says can be done with leftover funds. And then R&R, again, still it's repair and renovation, so it can be moved to another project. You'll just check with your system office to make sure that you're using whatever accounts they prefer and making sure that you have a project lined up you can move those funds to. For year end and quarterly capital closeout, the main thing we're checking is that the budget code and the budget funds are in balance so that we're not seeing any negatives. And for the expenditure part, we're looking at the expenditure totals, not necessarily the individual expenditure lines. So if you have some mismatching amongst the expenditure lines, that's okay. We're not going to hold you up for closeout as long as the total expenditures is in balance. We're okay. You might want to go back and fix that later, but it's not going to hold you up for close. So what we're looking at there when we're closing out capitals, we're looking for negative budgets and we're looking for overexpended account lines. So we're looking at that 725 report that we've been following along with, and we're checking to see, is there a negative budget? Did we move too much? Is there some error there? Or have we spent too much in an account that hasn't been allotted that much or hasn't been budgeted that much? We're also checking against the RK402 report. Some of you may be familiar. That is a report in the IBIS system that really tracks the entries for a capital project. So we'll check against that and make sure that those are lining up. If they don't line up, sometimes with the interfacing that's happening now, often that means that we actually have to go get a tech team ticket to fix the issue. One note for the RK402 is that older transactions, you might still have to pull up the legacy version of the report in order to see. So sometimes you'll need to pull the legacy RK402 and the regular RK402 side by side if you're checking against that. But again, we're checking the 725 first. That's the official record that we're checking against. So this is just an example of what we're looking at. We're looking at those funding sources for the SCIF. Ignore the interfund here, but we're looking to make sure, okay, this is FY 2024 SCIF. Does it have that FY 2024 account and the FY 2024 funding source? On the right side, what we're looking at is the budgets, and mainly in this case, we're looking at expenditures versus revenues. Generally, those should match up. There's not much appropriation in capital projects anymore, so we wouldn't expect anything other than zero in the excess of expenditures line. Obviously, if a project, an older project, did have appropriation, we would see something there, but otherwise, we're making sure that the budgets match up and are in balance. And then the final at the bottom, that's pointing mainly to allotment balance. So we're making sure that projects aren't overexpended. So if it's a positive, that's good. That means you've been allotted more than you've spent, you're budgeted more than you spent. But if it was negative, we might need you to do a revision and or an allotment to make sure that the project isn't spent over what's been budgeted or what's been allotted. So this is an example of a previous schedule we sent out for closeout. This would be for year-end closeout. It's going to be very similar to quarter end, what we're checking for. But a couple notes. One is that because of how we close out the end of the year, and sometimes it can be slower to start up the beginning of a fiscal year, if you have a project that you know needs cash on hand for some invoices, go ahead and allot extra in that June month to make sure you have enough to get you through maybe the mid part of July on the project. Feel free to send allotments for additional funds just to make sure you can get through that transition period. Additionally, on the schedule here, you'll see June 20th is the capital cash close. That does not mean that at June 20th you can do no more revisions. That means that OSBM at that point expects you to be done, will review stuff, and if you need additional revisions to clean up things for close, we'll let you know and you can still submit them. We just like to flag that because we know the date, can be a little confusing, but we can still do revisions after June 20th. So if you have a budget code that you are wanting to close, so let's say you are done with all of the projects in that budget code, and you want to pull it off of your reports, first thing you'll need to make sure is, as we mentioned with the transfers, you'll want to find any allotment balance that's left over, unallot it, and transfer it where it needs to go, because we really want the budget to match allotments to match actuals there. So we should see 0 allotment balance. So we're going to do revisions and allotments to make sure those are all aligned. So you'll return any cash balance to the correct funding source, meaning if it is R&R, let's transfer that to another R&R project. If it's a SCIF name project, it may need to be reverted to the SCIF, get it where it needs to go. A quick note at the bottom here is that budget codes with year-to-date spending, from OSBM's perspective, we can still approve those. We're okay with if they have year-to-date spending to approve the budget code for closeout, but OSC may hold it up until that shows a 0 for the year-to-date spending. I think there's something on their end where they need the year-to-date to be 0 before they can actually pull it out of NCFS. So just be aware that that is a potential holdup from it being removed from NCFS. The overall procedure here is that the agency or the university will submit a form. It's on our website, and we send it out at year end as well. You'll submit a form identifying which budget codes you are ready to close. Again, making sure that budget equals allotments equals actuals for every individual budget fund within that budget code. We'll review it, make sure we don't see any errors, and we'll let you know if we see anything that needs corrected. And then we will sign off on that form and send it to OSC. That form doesn't pull anything out of NCFS just yet. It more of lets OSC know OSBM is okay with this budget code closing. At that point, the agency or university will need to follow up with NCFS or with OSC with an NCFS ticket requesting the budget code to close. OSC should already have the OSBM approval form at that point, so they can do their checks, and as part of their checks, they're checking to see that OSBM is okay with that. So just know that after you submit the form to OSBM, you will still need to submit that ticket and follow up with OSC to have a budget code removed from NCFS. So with that 725 follow along example, this would be an example of one we wouldn't yet close because it would be okay to close for a quarter closeout, but we wouldn't close the budget code because we're seeing that allotment balance there. That needs to be transferred wherever it needs to go. And then the year to date there, again, OSBM is okay with seeing that, but that might prevent it from being pulled off the reports until OSC is seeing a 0 for the year to date.
All right, thank you all so much. We hope that this has been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the staff listed on the slide for OSBM budget execution. I'm Anna Carney and have been with Brian Farmer. And then we also have Cole Justad, as well as our Assistant State Budget Officer, Mark Bondo. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.